G'day, welcome back. This is the next video in my series on World Chess Championship blunders, and now we finally got to 1972, famous match between Spassky and Fischer. I'll be doing two videos on this match. The next video will be a more traditional one where I'll sort of run you through the lead up to the match and the sort of more typical blunders which were in it. Yeah, there were a couple. However, today I'm addressing what, without exaggeration, is the elephant in the room. Fischer's famous bishop takes h2 blunder, with air quotes around that, which I wasn't even too sure I was going to cover this, because obviously it's famous as a mistake, let's say, but it didn't really sort of satisfy my criteria, because normally the blunders I've been looking at have been of the order of 200, 300, 400 centipawns. And actually, when you look at it, although it's obviously a bad move, doesn't really qualify in that criteria. However, I mean, obviously it's a famous bad move, and for a certain generation of players like myself, understanding this has been it's been a mystery. Was it losing? Were there certain winning lines? All that sort of stuff has been sort of ongoing, and maybe we finally, with the use of engines and so on, we've got to the answer. But that doesn't count all the amazing analysis. Many sort of strong players have looked at this and tried to work out what was really going on. So that's kind of a bit of background. Obviously, it's going to be my longest video by a long shot. And as we go through some of the analysis and lines, it's probably worthwhile, having a computer board up so you can sort of see and understand some of the alternatives which are out there. You could just use Skid like I do, or Lichess, or chess.com, or whatever. Now, this is a sort of a summary, I guess, of what's been known about this position over the last 50 odd years. And I'll be drawing on a lot of books, which I've got sort of. It's almost like in every book I've got, yeah. I've got the Speelman one, a different one this time, Analysing the Endgame, and he has 20 pages on it, which is quite amazing. The famous analysis quite soon after the match by Olafsson, I have to sort of address that because there was a certain line which was thought to be winning and wasn't. And there are other names out there, Bh2 and Kasparov and so on, and Euwe and Timman. They wrote the match book as well, right? So there's we're drawing all these amazing, great players. We'll be following Speelman's approach the most, and we'll get onto that in a second when I move across the capture screen. Obviously, an enormous amount of ink has been spilt on this position and analysing it. I'm just scratching the surface, just a bit of a summary and sort of the current thoughts on where it is, and obviously drawing on all these sort of great players who I mentioned. I'm just going to start off with a few pictures just to sort of give a sense of what was going on. First of all, let me have a look. We've got this one. So this is I think this is from the video footage, and it's a shot of Fischer pushing the clock, and you can see the bishops there is on h2. It looks like the correct position. Spassky's bishop and king seem to be in the right spots, as does Fischer's king. So that's sort of the position. Quickly showing you what I'll be drawing on. This is the start of the chapter by Speelman, and goes in a lot of detail. And then one thing I've did, the second shot I'm showing there is it's quite important in this position. We'll cover it a few times. Is actually one of the main drawing resources of black is liquidating all the kingside pawns and rushing across to possible fortresses on the queenside. So we're going to deal with that quite a bit. It's quite interesting. And then just finally, this is the section from Kasparov's fourth, my great predecessors, putting a question mark IA4, which doesn't really deserve a question mark, and then giving exclamation mark to King G4, which doesn't really deserve an exclamation mark. So that's what we're going to have to sort of look through. And then finally, this is just the section from an earlier book. This is of Timman, their section on it. Same sort of thing. You can see, even up to the time of Kasparov, people were still really relying on the amazing work which Olafsson did, which, computers sort of have resolved some of these things in different ways. Okay, so now let's go to my capture screen. Sorry about that long intro diatribe. So this is kind of what we're going to be trying to go through. You can see that I put the analysis up here. We're going to be following mainly Speelman with his 20 pages of in analysing the endgame, and he will be referring to Olafsson, Kasparov, Euwe, Timman. Bh2 did some work. A lot of famous players have really, done all the hard yards on this. And then I like the way he's really structured the way of trying to understand the position. So he's broken it down into 6 kind of positions to try and understand it. So I'm going to go through that way, and hopefully that'll help us understand it better. First of all, we have a couple of positions position 0, I call it position 0, but he's got 6 positions. Position 0, position 1, which are sort of early sidelines, different alternatives to the way that the bishop surrenders itself, and just to warm up. We can just warm up on those and get a bit of a sense of the position. Both those early sidelines are losing. And then the main thing will be the position after king d6. Let's just quickly move there. This is the position here, which requires a lot of discussion of, this is where Speelman goes on to the pawn formation concept on the queen side. Can the king side be liquidated and the queen side be a fortress of sorts? And then also, this is where they gave a4 a question mark, which didn't deserve, and king g4 an exclamation mark, which kind of didn't deserve either, because they were sort of, historically regarded. And actually, both those lines are still drawing. This position is drawn, right? Just I think that's the key. And then later on, alternatives to king e4 as we go along a little bit. King e4 was regarded as a mistake at one stage as well. And actually, that seems quite unfair as well. There are sort of different alternatives there. And then finally, we get to this position where f5 is the actual blunder. This position is drawn. This position is winning for white. So that's the thing. And looking at and a couple of moves later, f4 as well. Also, the position was lost already. So it's mainly the f5 move. And just as we sort of go through this, we'll be ticking off defensive resources, white to draw, and then white f5 loses. F5 seems to makes it much more difficult for black to liquidate the king side in a fashion which allows him to get a fortress on the queen side. And then that's the outline. We'll be following a Speelman relatively closely, and at the end, we'll sort of summarize it all and sort of wrap up in terms of, f5 was a blunder, and it should have. That's kind of where the state of play is at the moment. Okay, so let's get cracking on with these sort of first couple of sidelines, which are a good start to understanding the position. Okay, so let's get back to the starting position, which is right there. Fischer has just played bishop takes h2. The next few moves kind of make sense. Obviously, what we've got is g3, which is trapping the bishop, and now black plays h5 to try and break the bishop out. But white's king can get across in time to prevent the escape of the bishop by holding onto the g3 square, which is the next two moves. You saw there g4 was a possibility. It will actually transpose, right? So what we want to get at here is what happened in the game is that king e7 first, and then once the bishop was threatened, you had the exchange on g3, and then from that, the bishop then has to give itself up for an extra pawn, and you got 2 pawns for the bishop. That's the game. But we go back a few moves. In this position here, there are two alternative variants, which I've just got this way of just visualizing it from a little tool I've got. So we'll just follow through the steps here. G3, went down too quickly, sorry. G3, I'll drag it here. G3, and then H5, breaking the bishop out, king E2, tracking across, and then we have H4, then followed by king to E2, and then you can see a sideline here. If you have a look at this line down here, this is where G5 is played. King goes across. We'll go through on the board. And then H4 is played, and then after the bishop is taken, you end up this position here. I was following down this variant here, where you actually have an advanced protected passed pawn on H3, which restricts the white king very badly. So that's one alternative way of surrendering the bishop. And then you have this line here where you make the king come around the back side. You just push the pawn to h3, the king comes around the back side, and then you can see that the bishop now starts to escape, but doesn't escape because after the king to h3, we'll go through these lines, and the bishop takes f2, you got this final key move, bishop d2. People have argued it's bishop d2, which Fischer had missed. Lots of speculation. Was it a miscalculation? And you can see once again that the black bishop here is trapped and will have to give it up self for one of those 2 pawns. So this is what I'm going to call position 0 and position 1. Position 1 is the Speelman position, and we'll be following his analysis on these 2 lines. So I'll just close that, get that out of the way, and we'll just have a look at those lines, right? So let's have a look at position 0 and early h3, and what demonstrated is that the king had to then come around to pick up the bishop in that fashion. So let's have a look at that line, h3, rather than taking on the g3 square. So let's have a look. The white king has to go around. Bishop's trying to escape that way. Take the pawn. Take that pawn. bishop d2, trapping the bishop again. And then now, okay, before that, so now we've got this is kind of the position, and obviously the king's going to go back and pick up the bishop. Okay, so just briefly, I call this position 0 because Speelman doesn't give it much coverage. What he says is black can try h3, king g4, bishop g1, bishop takes h3, bishop take f2, but bishop d2 exclamation mark keeps the bishop trapped. Okay, that's the line we just gone through. Black has lost time but has obtained the additional, though probably useless, option of bishop takes e3. So that's all Speelman says about it. But we're going to use this as an opportunity to try and understand the position a little bit better. There's a few possible lines here. Let's just have a look. Right, so we've got a6, which disrupts the queenside pawn structure, king moves, or e5. Now, according to the engine, they are all winning for white. So that kind of means, you know, this alternative's not good. But let's have a look at probably the most challenging line, which, as I said, is this a6 line. So we'll just go along with that line. a6. Now, white has to keep moving, so the line given by our friend Stockfish, king g2. Okay, grab the g-pawn rather than the e-pawn. Seems to be the preferred computer line. So we've got this position we're very familiar with. Black has 2 extra pawns, and the question is, will it be enough to hold the draw? And in fact, now we've got a 3-pawn advantage. This is still given as winning. Now, part of the reason is, we'll look at again later, this pawn structure on the queenside. We'll come back to it, but Speelman also has a comment about this a little bit later on. I'll just run over it quickly now because I think it's really interesting to understand. Diagram 113, according to Speelman. Diagram 113 is one on the same principle. Either white will stalemate black to force b4, which he can take, transforming the sickly a pawn into a healthy young b pawn, or he will win both pawns whilst keeping the black king out of the corner. Now, there's some line there. We'll look at this again later, but the idea is that if the black king is in the corner, he'll get trapped, stalemated, and he'll have to move his pawns forward. And then once white gets a b pawn, he'll be winning. And otherwise, if the black king is not in the corner, somewhere over there, then white will just pick up the pawns and promote the a pawn. So that's the logic. So this pawn structure, we'll see it again later, that is a win for white if everything else is off the board. Right, so, all the kingside pawns are liquidated. Let's continue with this line. So, first thing to do, now that white has a structure he can rely on the queen side, he needs to liquidate the pawns on the king side, advances the king. I mean, there's not a lot of choice here because black will run out of moves, and either the white king's going around behind the pawns and winning them, or forcing the move forwards, and then we'll pick them off. Several ways of winning this. Let's go king g6. Right, so we're going to pick the pawns up. Black is able to move around and ensure he gets the e-pawn off the board. So now he's just... So let's see how white wins. This is the sort of position, in this case, black can get into the corner. Obviously, white can hold his a-pawn, has to hold his a-pawn. Having done that, black changes his mind. According to this line, goes into the corner. Okay, so we will follow black into the corner. White's using his bishop to gain tempos. Now, if black is ever forced to push his b-pawn, then white will win. This square was covered. So the black king approaches, and now we're getting to the crunch moment. So there's 2 king moves which are possible here. Just a bit of maneuvering around. 2 king moves. Both of them lose. Let's do king a8. That's the main line. Now we do that. We've stalemated the black king. Pawn gets pushed. We'll take it. Other pawn gets pushed, and then you release the stalemate and you win. And if we come back to this position here, the other move was to go to the a6 square. Let's go a6. See what happens now. It's going to be the same stalemate problem. So actually, it's in this position, it's actually giving black advances pawn. But let's say black continues to move up. So you can see it's going to be the same thing. He'll have to push the pawn at some stage because he's either losing his pawns and he's not going to be in the corner. That's the other. Just a good example. Lost his pawns, but he's not going to be able to get the corner. So white will win that position. So I say that's position 0, and I hope if we go back to the start of position 0, which I think is around about here, you can see the idea that the line we've just shown, kingside gets liquidated, but white is left with a winning queenside pawn structure. Okay, so the next one we wanted to look at was what Speelman called position number 1. This variant here where he just pushes the H pawn, and then we're trying to trap the bishop, and rather than keeping the bishop, we now do this. So now we have this structure where the white king looks terribly tied down. Let's see what Speelman has to say about this position. Okay, white king is tied to stopping the pawn, but by accurate maneuvering he can replace it by his bishop and win. And then he gives some lines, and we'll just go through the line and get the general idea of why this is also a winning position for white. I mean, I've run this to the engine once again. If you look at there's a number of alternative lines for white. They are all winning. Those 4 lines are winning. So basically, but the main thrust of it is this first one we're going to use, where he breaks down the pawn chain. F3, if that ever gets taken, then obviously black will lose the H pawn and probably the rest of his pawns, so he has to hold the pawn chain together. So white has to bust the pawn chain apart. Now there's not much to do. Can move his king up, cause some disturbance. We're going to have a few lines here, but let's try A5 as, for instance, just a different way of doing it. Could have done A6 and we'd probably end up with the same structure as last time, but this is just a different way of trying it. Okay, so now to simplify things, we get rid of all the pawns like that. We can lock the A pawn on A5 where it is likely to be vulnerable. You can see this particular line. This is the maneuver for getting the king out. The black pawn can't advance yet. We block the H pawn. We give up the queenside pawns. But now it's just simply a case of if he takes these pawns, we're going to mop up the kingside pawns. See that continuation. And you can see that after these pawns here are gone, we'll use the bishop to control this pawn. And that will be the winning pawn. So this is a different way of doing it, actually, because in this situation, the kingside wasn't liquidated, and therefore white got his winning opportunity from having a pawn there, which would be queenie. Okay, so that's just all we were going to talk about on those 2 sidelines. I fixed this chart was a little bit long last time, so we'll just sort of go through it again. What we were looking at was G3, King E2, H4, G5 was that alternative line, just going down the left-hand side, going down the right-hand side there, you can G5, King F3, G4 check, King G2, H4, King takes H2 and H3. That's position 1 we've just looked at. And the other line was after King F3, using H3 to block the king's access. The king goes the long way around, and we ended up with this position where Bishop D2 was played. The bishop's trapped, and according to Speelman, black's actually lost a lot of time doing that, and that is also lost. So now what we're going to do is going to return to the main line where King F3, King E7, King G2, and then black H takes G3, F takes G3, B takes G3, King takes G3. That is going to be the next major position we'll have a look at. So let's just get that up on the board. Now, at this stage, Speelman actually goes into a digression on pawn formations on the queenside, which ones are drawing, which ones are winning, which becomes an important factor. We've seen it already in the lines we've just considered. So actually, before we go on to this position here, but bear that in your mind, that's where we're going to come back to, we'll look at the queenside pawn structures which Speelman was talking about, so that we can understand later on when we're looking at continuations, which ones have a fortress on the queenside and which ones don't. Just one moment. Okay, so what I've done here is the lead-in paragraph here by Speelman says, finally, black can try to reach a drawn position by exchanging off some or all of the kingside pawns for white's e-pawn. This is his most plausible course of action. In this context, diagrams 109 to 115 are of interest. So let's go through these diagrams and what we're talking about. Here's one possible ending. Obviously, this is a draw. We all know that diagram 109 is a draw with or without the black's rook pawn, but maybe diagrams 110 and 111 aren't so familiar. Okay, let's have a look at 110. Diagram 110 is drawn whether or not the black king gets to the corner as long as it reaches c8. In fact, what happens is that you may actually end up oscillating between these two squares and you can't be forced back. And if you are forced back, well, then you're getting stalemated. So you just need to reach c8. This would remain the case if we remove both rook's pawns as well. So basically, if those two pawns are there, that's the fortress position that you can get into. Okay, so that's good. Let's move on to the next one, 111. This is different though. Diagram 111, white wins by first stalemating the black king to force a5 and then taking that pawn. Okay, let's have a look how that's done. He gives a line. King e7, king b8, king d7, forcing the black king, king a8, bishop d6. There's a stalemate trick already. Has to push his pawn, release the stalemate, and then now bishop to e3, bishop to d2, picked up the pawn. And the line continues. In fact, you just press the pawn, takes, and then now you'll promote your queen. There's no stalemate here because the a pawn can still move. Okay, so that's the first couple of positions. So you can see it's slightly different, this one. Rather than having the extra pawn on b6, white's lost that pawn, but he has his bishop there. And actually, he's better off having lost the pawn. White wins diagram 112 by stalemating the black king in the corner. This forces b5, which is taken en passant as there's no stalemate because of black's a pawn. Very familiar with what we have just been looking at. And then let's now move on to diagram 113. Diagram 113, this is very similar to what we just saw in position number 0. Either white will stalemate black to force b4, which he can take, transforming, blah, blah, blah. Right, so I've read through that before. Let's have a look at the line which Speelman gives for this. So let's put the kings in more normal positions with the black king in the corner, thinking he's going to survive. And let's go through the line. It's going to be similar to the line in the actual position, but just this is Speelman's take on it. Force the black king in the corner, stalemate. Okay, now what happens? Got to push the b pawn. Bring the bishop back. Stalemate, push the other pawn. Now there's a little trick here that it's showing king c7 as a mistake, because what happens is that this position ends up being drawn because you have to lose the bishop, and you've lost the bishop, although you'll pick up the pawn. Black will take the opposition against you and it will be drawn. So that's funny. You have to be a bit careful with these things. And just continue. Bishop d6, come back to a8, stalemate again. So remember the danger was as long as the king's not on c7. So basically what happens here is that now pawn gets pushed again, drop the bishop back, and now this is clearly a winning position. That is the situation where, so that's diagram 113. We've effectively covered that twice. Let's move on to figure 124. I've stepped forwards a bit in the game, because this is a very important drawing structure which may occur in some of the lines. So we put the white bishop on e1. Doesn't really matter where there's a couple of winning positions for white, but basically this is drawn. We'll just go through a line which Speelman gives. White can force his king to c6 or even a6, but this doesn't help. So let's go through a line here. Bit of moving around. Okay, so basically white will have to advance like that. But if you look at it, black will always have enough squares to move to keep pressuring the white pawn. And he can do it from 1, 2, or 3 squares. And we'll see in a minute that 3 squares will be enough. Let's say the white king is there. If the white king ever took the a pawn, then black would just pick up the b pawn. And as I said, so he's got 1, 2, 3 squares. And the bishop can only cover one of them, so black will always be able to sort of move backwards and forwards between those squares and hold the pressure on the white b pawn. Right, so that's a very interesting drawn position, that one. Okay, so I've gone through that fairly quickly. You can see those different structures. Some are drawn and some are winning. And as we now return to the Fischer-Spassky game, we keep that in the back of our mind. What sort of pawn structures does black need to seek so that he can draw the position? Okay, here we are back in the position of the game where Spassky played a4, and this is what Speelman says about that. This is a perfectly reasonable move. White protects his b pawn and opens a3 to f8 diagonal for his bishop, which really does need to get into the game. Okay, makes sense. But then perhaps a4 was a little slow. Olafsson has suggested that white should give priority to an immediate attempt to weaken the black pawns with king g4. So you can see there's a few other moves there, but basically we're going to look at a4, main line, we'll look at that later, and then king g4, Olafsson's supposed winning line. Now let's have a look. I've just done a sort of this from that position, just sort of showing what we're at. So we're going to look here at king g4, and then that splits into one line, king d5, and then you can see that going and sort of exchanging pawns on the king side straight away. and the other line is g6, right? So we'll look at both those lines, and g6 has its own little continuation. Once again, advance the king, and very similarly, you get basically get rid of the e-pawn. We'll look at those lines in a sec, but what Olafsson contended that g6 is forced, and what Speelman says, I don't actually believe that this. So we're going to look at the g6 one, since that was kind of supposedly the only move that could be played, and then as we saw, the other continuation, which was a king to a d5, king d4, g6, okay, a4. It's going to be played eventually, one feels. And now there's a couple of potential lines here. You can either play king d5 or a6. Both of them are drawing. It's the a6 line. Okay, check. King d5 anyway. b6. Don't want the pawns to be exchanged. Now this is where in Speelman's book, which kind of comes from Olafsson's analysis as well, they'd considered king c6 dropping back, and actually that's unnecessary, right? And basically you should just continue with e5, bishop e7, king e6, hold the pawn. You get positions like this, which you can see that it doesn't have the fortress structure yet on the queen side, but it looks like it will end up with a distracting couple of pawns on the king side, which will cause problems. So line is a draw, and we can go through another line here where rather than forcing the issue straight away on the queen side, we advance our king d5, again following Speelman, bishop a3. The analysis from Olafsson is actually e5, and e5 is a losing move in this position. Better to advance your king e4, to hold the pawn. Don't actually have that line in my variation. a6 often gets played, b6 met by b6. Now we play e5, bishop e7 is often played, taking the weak spot back there. And now the best move is you grab the pawn. Let's see how this works. Pawn, king marches. Now, there's not really much to be done here, because let's just, for instance, let's not push the a-pawn yet. Move the king. Just going to run across, and you're going to have to hold the pawn now. e5. We can protect. King b5. The bishop's going to be, this bishop will be distracted by that pawn, and the b pawn will drop. That's just a sample line. So what we're really saying is, when king g4 was played and Olafsson thought g6 was forced and loses, g6 doesn't lose, and king d5 is also a very strong move. In fact, pretty much any of those moves, king e5, king c5, almost everything actually does draw. And it just seems that in the analysis, I mean, this is very deep analysis, just subtly wrong, an e5 at the wrong time, or a king move at the wrong time. So basically, in the end of all that, Speelman came to the conclusion that king g4 is actually drawing. And once you accept king g4 is drawing, you kind of accept that the whole position is drawn. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to go back to the game continuation, which was a4, and look at a few other variations which come out of it. a4. So this game continuation, king to d5, activating the bishop, king to e4. If you look at that, there's a bunch of moves. All those moves are drawing. So look, king to e. So we're pressuring the e pawn, protect the e pawn with the bishop. We don't want to lose the a pawn. Push the a pawn, and push the b pawn. So this all makes a lot of sense. Now we come to the key position. There are three moves to draw here. G6. We get back to similar lines we saw before. G6, king g4 is one possibility. King f5 also draws, and e5. I think e5 is sort of given as a sort of the best move here. Let's see what Speelman says about it. So he's got, this is position 5. I believe, I've skipped position 4, king e4. There was nothing wrong with king e4. At the time, it was believed there was overcommittal, but king e4 doesn't seem to be bad in any shape or form. So this is where we get the thing where Speelman gives e5 in this position an exclamation mark. Fischer played 39 f5 in diagram 127, which is exactly where we are now. It seems that this was the decisive error after which black could not save the game. He should have played e5. So let's have a look at some of these continuations. e5. This is Speelman's line. King g4, g6. So you blocked the white king out. Got to spend a bishop tempo to break up the pawn structure. King takes e3, so that pawn's gone. f6, and king d4. We were at this diagram exactly before. White would win if he had time to organize his forces. He needs the bishop on the g1 to b6 diagonal, where it stops both pawns and defends his b-pawn. And the king must go to the queenside. But there isn't time to achieve both these objectives before black equalizes. And he gives a few lines. Let's just go through one of these lines and see what the continuation is. Okay, bishop's dropping back at that diagonal. Okay, we've held the b-pawn, but now we're just going to go into that stalemate position. And whether... I mean, you can lose your pawns. And this is that stalemate position we talked about, which is why we looked at those previous, what are drawing formations on the queenside. This is one of them, right? So I say that's why we looked at these queenside formations like that. So there we go. So basically e5 was a drawing move. So that was, there's quite a few pages on this. And then so now I think let's move to the game again. Just have a quick look at where we are. Okay, so we were looking at this position and f5, game continuation, loses, king h4. It's actually king h4 is very clever. We'll probably just focus on the game continuation now, which king h4 penetrating on the king side weaknesses caused by the move f5, and then Fischer continued with f4. Doesn't really matter at that stage. And then versus e5 line we've just looked at. So basically we peeled off these different layers, and now we basically got to the end where after f4, having been a drawn game all the way along, now it is losing. So let's just do that. Let's stick to the game continuation. There is f5. See, a number of moves. King h4 is the only winning move. So Spassky identified very, very quickly that this was the correct approach. It does actually look a bit concerning because Fischer is able to trap the white king on the side of the board, and it takes a little bit of extricating. There's a few different moves which have been considered by different commentators. They're all losing now, so it doesn't matter. So f4 was regarded as either the main error in the past or a follow-up error. Actually, doesn't really make a lot of difference. Okay, so f4, take that pawn, and then king takes f4. So issue here is that the pawn structure on the queen side is not a fortress situation yet. The bishop is on this ideal diagonal for both blocking the pawns and holding the b-pawn. So that's why it's quite advantageous. So let's just go through the game continuation now. King to f5, king to h5. So black must keep the white king blocked in. Bishop to e3. Some gentle maneuvering here. The idea is you get the bishop on that square, and then now the king will be able to extricate itself. That pawn's blocked. The other pawn's going to fall. Let's go quickly towards the end of the game. Obviously white's going to pick up that pawn and then queen it. So I think I'm done with that. Hopefully you found the visualizations useful. So just to summarize, I mean, obviously we're using Speelman, right? We sort of peeled back the layers. First of all, there was these couple of early continuations with different ways of surrendering the bishop, and both of those were viewed as they would have been winning for white. But then we looked at the game continuation after some bit of a tangent, looking at the queenside pawn structures, which ones are fortresses, which actually could be pretty important. And we saw them pop up repeatedly in some of the continuations we did. We then dismissed the idea that Olafsson's king g4 line was winning. In fact, king g4 was drawing, and there were several drawing lines which black could have used. And then we kind of skipped this, wasn't that important. And basically it was all about f5 was the losing move, and e5 and g6 at that stage were both, the game was still drawn. And then once you played f5, the game's losing, and Spassky hit on the strategy of being able to advance through the weakened king side. And as you see, that the other lines with e5 and g6 all would have prevented that, or black would have been extra tempos up on the same line and be able to set up a fortress or pick off enough white pawns. Okay, bit different than usual. I mean, next time we're back to the actual sort of blunders of the 1972 World Chess Championship match. I hope you enjoyed that summary of the bishop takes h2 blunder / not blunder.